Okay, so we're diving deep today into something that really shook things up globally, the hands-off protests back on April 5th, 2025, aimed at President Trump and Elon Musk.
It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and, our sources are pointing to just this massive wave of demonstrations. I mean, over 1,200 across every single state here in the U.S.
Yeah, it even kind of spilled over, into Europe with solidarity actions in some major cities like Berlin and London.
Exactly. So clearly something resonated really widely, but, the question is what exactly brought so many people out into the streets in the first place?
Right. So at its core, you've got this kind of groundswell of public discontent,
Mm-hmm.
and a big part of that was definitely a reaction to the Trump administration's push to, like streamline government, make it more efficient.
Yeah.
And Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, was really at the forefront of all that.
So DOGE actually had some pretty tangible effects then.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean,
Wow.
there were a lot of federal workers who lost their jobs.
Wow.
And reports started coming out about them scaling back Social Security Administration field offices,
Hmm.
all in the name of efficiency.
Yeah, and I think, beyond just the operational changes, there was this real undercurrent of fear about where the government was heading in general, right?
Absolutely.
It felt like these fundamental protections, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid that people rely on, were suddenly on the chopping block.
Yeah, you're right. It was almost like a questioning of the role of government in people's lives.
And I think the fact that Elon Musk, this figure from the private sector, was leading DOGE really added to the anxiety around it.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. It became this sort of, is this about efficiency or is this about corporate interests shaping policy?
Right, and all of that kind of fed into the protests. But it wasn't just about this restructuring of the government, was it? I mean, there were a bunch of other policy shifts that people were pushing back against, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We saw opposition to those new tariffs. Remember those?
Yeah.
And then there were changes to human rights policies.
Right, deportations, transgender rights, all that.
Exactly. And then, of course, you had the reductions in federal health program funding. It was like a perfect storm of
Yeah.
issues all kind of converging at once.
It really was. And, to your point about it not being a single issue protest, the sheer number of groups involved is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, over 150 different organizations.
Yeah.
From all walks of life. You had labor unions, civil rights advocates, environmental groups, all these different voices coming together.
Yeah, and it's clear this wasn't just some spontaneous outburst, right? There was real organization behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw people like Paul Osadebe from the labor movement,
Yeah.
Kelly Robinson from the Human Rights Campaign, Ezra Levin from Indivisible, all taking a leading role, and even some political figures, Representatives Raskin and Frost, Senator Markey, they were all out there too.
It's really interesting when you look at who was being targeted,
Hmm.
right? Because obviously the protests were aimed at President Trump's agenda,
Hmm.
all that talk about downsizing, government cutting social program. But then you also had Elon Musk becoming a very specific focus.
Right. I mean, being the head of DOGE and owning X, that's a lot of influence.
It is, yeah. And people were clearly worried about that.
Mhm.
And, it even went beyond the marches and rallies. There was this whole Tesla takedown movement happening at the same time.
Oh, yeah, with the protests at Tesla dealerships?
Exactly, a very direct way of sending a message.
So with all this pressure, how did the Trump administration actually respond?
Well, it came out pretty strongly, reassuring everyone about President Trump's commitment to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
But then they also turned around and accused the Democrats of wanting to expand those benefits to undocumented immigrants.
Oh, wow. So kind of deflecting.
Yeah, framing it as a way to, you know, bankrupt the system.
Right, right.
And then Liz Houston, the assistant press secretary, she flatly denied any plans to reduce funding for Medicaid and Social Security.
So what was the overall message coming from the White House in all this?
Basically that President Trump was not backing down.
Mm-hmm.
White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt made that very clear. But it is interesting that Melania Trump ended up postponing some of her garden tours because of safety concerns.
Oh, wow. So they definitely weren't ignoring it.
Right. Even if they weren't changing course, it seems like they were at least aware of the impact those protests were having.
So looking back, I mean, what do you think really stands out about this whole hands-off movement? And what are some of the longer-term effects we might see down the road?
I mean, in the short term, I think it's undeniable that these protests grabbed everyone's attention, put these issues front and center in the national conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
But looking ahead, into the medium term, who knows? Maybe this shifts public opinion in a lasting way. Maybe it influences future policy decisions or even electoral outcomes. And then there's Elon Musk.
Right. I mean, he was already a controversial figure.
Exactly. And this whole thing probably just puts him under an even bigger microscope.
So we're not just talking about some abstract political beat, right? I mean, this had a real impact on people's lives. And we actually have some firsthand accounts that really bring that home.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about policy, but when you hear from the people who are directly affected by it, that's when it gets real.
Absolutely. Like in Woodstock, Georgia, there were people talking about fearing for the future of the country, saying they wouldn't recognize it anymore.
Right.
Some even calling President Trump a liar right on their signs.
Yeah, and others were telling Elon Musk he wasn't welcome. Pretty strong words.
Then you had Washington, D.C., with people carrying signs about losing their benefits.
I remember seeing that one sign, they're eating the checks.
So powerful. And, Kelly Robinson from the Human Rights Campaign, she talked about how the administration's actions against the LGBTQ plus community felt deeply personal.
Yeah, it's different when it feels like an attack on who you are.
Exactly. And then there was that retiree in Columbus, Ohio. He just sounded so disillusioned.
Yeah, he talked about being so disappointed with President Trump tearing this country apart. That's a pretty heavy accusation.
It is. And then down in Florida, the focus was all about protecting Social Security.
Keep their hands off our Social Security. That was their message, loud and clear.
And then Boston was really interesting, huge crowds with signs all about democracy, Social Security, and the importance of diversity.
Right. It really highlighted how interconnected all these issues were.
Yeah, and in Charlotte, one of the protesters summed it up really well. I thought she said that the administration's approach was basically about prioritizing the wealthy.
Right.
And, hearing all these different voices from across the country, it really drives home just how widespread these concerns were.
It does, and I think it speaks to the power of collective action. When people come together like that, it can really send a message.
Right. And I think that's what makes the hands-off protests so significant, not just what happened on that day, but what it says about the relationship between government technology and everyday people. It really makes you think, where do we go from here? What happens next?
It's definitely a question worth pondering.
It is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive for today, but it's a conversation that's definitely worth continuing. So keep those questions in mind, folks. And thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
It was great having you.
Take care.
You too.